We're live. All right. I have got with me Alexander Vickers in Athens, Greece. And we have got with us the great Mr. Robert Barnes. How are you, Robert?
Just let me know if the FBI knocks on your door suddenly. It's interesting times to be alive, no doubt about that.
All right. Yes, it is. And we are going to get into it real quick. But let's just say a very, very quick hello to everybody that is watching us on Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, Telegram, and Locals, the Duran.locals.com. Where can people find you, Robert?
They can find all of our content wherever it's shared at vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Fantastic Locals feed and a fantastic live streams that Robert does all the time, including the Hush Hush, which are the best around. And Alexander, I'm going to pass it to you in 1 minute. Let me just do one more quick hello to the moderators. Let's see who's with us moderating. We got Alan Watson in the house. Who else? Alan, are you alone? It looks like it. I'm sure some more moderators will come in. Alan, it's me and you. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Alexander. Real quick, does everyone hear us okay in the chat? If you can hear us okay, just say, give me a 1 if you can hear us all right in the chat, and we'll get started. Let's see. Hello from London. Hello from Thessaloniki. Yes, 111. Yes. Okay, fantastic. Everyone is waiting to hear from Robert. Alexander, Robert, get to it. I will be here moderating stuff and putting up super chat questions underneath, and we'll try to answer those as they come in. Alexander.
Well, you said at the start that we're living in interesting times. I think you said this before the program began, Robert. We are living in extraordinary times. I have never known anything like this to happen. When I first heard that the FBI was coming to Mar-a-Lago, I said to myself, this has to be something to do with, 6th January events. Turns out it's not even that. It's all about some documents that Trump took with him, possibly by mistake, most probably by mistake. 38 agents, if that's correct, turning up at his place. I mean, this is extraordinary. It's beyond bizarre, and it reminds me of what Talleyrand said about Napoleon. One of Napoleon's most egregious mistakes. He said, "This is worse than a crime. It's a mistake." This looks to me like a huge mistake in immediate political terms, because it's solidified the Republican Party behind Donald Trump. It's solidified the conservative public behind Donald Trump. It's convinced most people, many people at least, maybe not most people, but lots of people who maybe many of them didn't particularly like Donald Trump, that he is indeed being harassed by the deep state and its acolytes. But what makes it a particularly appalling mistake is what it is doing to the institutions of the United States. Once more, we see that these institutions are being used in the most extraordinary way to pursue what look to me obvious political agendas. So we have the FBI turning up at Donald Trump's residence for, frankly, on what look to me frivolous grounds, but presumably, I'm guessing some judge somewhere must have approved this thing. The FBI, the head of the FBI, presumably approved it. I'm not sure whether the Attorney General knew. I gather the White House says that they didn't know, but whatever. The institutions of the United States most important law enforcement agency, the Justice Department, of which the FBI is in a sense a part, all of these now look like they are being used as part of some political campaign against one individual who happens to have the support of tens of millions of Americans. You're destroying the credibility of these institutions. You're dividing Americans from them. You're making Americans, more and more Americans, distrust them. I cannot conceive of anything more damaging to the structure of the republic than this.
Yeah, August 8th, 2022 will be a day that lives in institutional infamy for the Justice Department. For those out there around the world that may have different policies and or precedents in their own country, in the United States of America, no former president has ever been raided by law enforcement. Needless to say, raided about things that related to the presidency and a person who is the leading opponent for the upcoming presidential election to the incumbent party. So this is a weaponization of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Justice Department and the federal courts that has never been done before in American history. Everything they accuse Trump of is what they've been guilty of in terms of breaking customs, breaking norms, breaking precedents, breaking traditions. Biden administration's been doing it throughout the country. And reinstating a range of politically motivated prosecutions and persecutions as FBI whistleblowers have been disclosing. The significance of the date is that DOJ internal policy is that no raids be conducted, no indictments be issued concerning any political party or candidate in the 90-day time period leading up to a major election. Well, yesterday was 91 days. So that was the last day they had if they were going to at least comply with that policy in terms of taking action. But I believe that the raid is a deep state raid disguised as maybe complicit in cahoots with the Democratic Party, but not a Democratic Party instigated, originated raid. It is most likely a deep state raid. I said so almost right away, and now more and more evidence is pointing in that direction that's coming out. What I mean by that is it appears Trump has some files that they don't want him to have, and that whatever's in those files is so sensitive to certain people in positions of power that they would risk massive political blowback from an unprecedented raid rather than Trump continue to have physical possession and custody of those records. In the United States, the president gets to keep those records. There's a protocol whereby the National Archives has them for a period of time, and then they return them to him for his presidential library. Every president in the past has kept these records, often refused to turn certain information over. Never has it ever even thought about escalating to criminal action. Even civil subpoena action doesn't take place. So my guess is there's something in it would be like Trump, who chose at the end under extortionate threats from Mitch McConnell and others, not only not to pardon Julian Assange, not to pardon Edward Snowden, but also not to declassify documents concerning a range of topics, including most prominently the Kennedy assassination, stuff that was supposed to have been declassified many years ago, and information related to Russiagate. But it may go past that. But it's information that may be embarrassing to the Justice Department, information that's embarrassing to the FBI, information that's embarrassing to the CIA, to the NSA, to other agencies involved who and what they were doing in the Russiagate, Spygate scandal. And so Trump may have chosen, as a way to protect himself, to keep certain records that he didn't want to see destroyed. And to be honest with you, the only reason to execute a raid to seize those records, I'm not convinced they're doing it because the National Archives wants to make sure they have the right copy. More likely is there's something in those records that is very embarrassing, that is independent evidentiary proof. The way they probably got the warrant was they know Trump knows what's in there. They didn't want anyone else to see those, and they probably said they had basis to believe that Trump was going to share it with somebody. And purportedly, Trump got this from allies. That usually means either the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Well, at one point, it was Richard Grenell was involved there, but later on, another individual was involved there. And he wanted to disclose things, for example, about China and other aspects involving Trump. There might be information there that's embarrassing to U.S. policy right now concerning China, for example. Trump has been highly publicly critical of Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. and of the Biden administration escalating military potential risk of military conflict in his own way, his own inimitable way, but clearly only American to be very critical of it in a high-ranking position of power. So who knows what's in there? But my guess is it's deep state documents, deep state files. They are so scared of those documents getting out and I think Trump was keeping it as insurance against indictment, insurance against assassination risk, insurance. The biggest parallel I remember where you had people at the level of potential presidents or actual presidents at a complete open war with the deep state in America. You can call it national security state, military industrial complex, whatever language anyone wants to use for it. Trump called it the administrative state yesterday in his public statement. Is the Kennedy brothers. And both of them were killed. So you can do with it what you will. But that's like someone was asking me, is there a parallel for this? I'm like, yeah, Trump trying to run in 2024 and talking about payback. Axios had a piece a month ago saying Trump and people around Trump are coming up with a plan to purge deep state operatives in the United States and the deep state apparatus in the United States. Is Robert Kennedy's campaign in 1968 when he said a week before his assassination, I plan on reopening the case concerning the assassination of my brother. And of course, his brother was assassinated in what many people consider to have been a deep state plot, not Lee Harvey Oswald acting by himself as a lone gunman that's a secret Soviet Cuban supporter. That narrative may be even a tougher narrative. This narrative may be even tougher than that one. The National Archives said you got to go raid Trump's house to make sure they have the right copy. That is not going to fly with the American people. This is about the Presidential Records Act. People are like, what? Well, it probably wasn't. But there was a little caveat at the end of the day. Apparently they didn't quite find what it was they were looking for. And so they brought a safe cracker in to crack Trump's safe. And they were finally going to get the documents, whatever it was Trump was hiding away. But the safe was empty. So we'll see what happens. Maybe Trump still has a couple of aces up his sleeve. But a dangerous day for America. I think it shows desperation by deep state operatives in the United States that are falling apart. Afghanistan fell apart. Ukraine's falling apart. Taiwan and China's a disaster. There's no way. There's no win way. As Colonel McGregor pointed out, we're not going into China. It ain't happening. So the only question is whether we do something stupid in the interim and do a little Curtis LeMay, let's see how nuclear weapons work kind of routine, which was the military's idea for China in the 1950s, in case people didn't know, in the United States, not just MacArthur and Korea. So it's accumulation. And now they got Trump surging. They got a Republican Party surging. They have a populist wing of the Republican Party surging. Joe Kent's former intelligence guy, but his wife was killed because of a rogue operation in Syria. People tend to not forget that kind of thing. And Joe Kent is now going to be likely in Congress and is going to be one of the principal deep state critics that's existed in Congress, coming from a very informed base of that. So I think, but what we saw was terrifying if you care about constitutional democracy. In terms of what took place yesterday, they set a precedent that's unparalleled in American history. Literally no precedent for it. It appears to be on the thinnest, weakest possible grounds, legally and constitutionally, and is outraged tens of millions of Americans to where they're now talking about we need a real church committee. We need a Jim Garrison-style special counsel when Trump comes in to investigate the deep state. We have major congressmen calling for the dismantling of the Federal Bureau of Investigation entirely. This was J. Edgar Hoover's abortion of an investigation agency. It was his creation. It's long overdue that it be gutted, if not stripped and taken away of its power. And serious, heavy-hitting political members are talking about that. Real church committees, so on and so forth. So hopefully it's a turning point against deep state corruption of American democracy. But at any rate, it is going to be a memorable day in American legal history.
Absolutely. Can I just say, Robert, what you are describing, I think everything that you said is completely plausible. But what you are describing is worse than a deep state. Because a deep state is something that exists within American institutions. This isn't a deep state anymore. It is a state within the state. It is, in effect, a group of people who are using the institutions of the United States, in effect, against itself against the United States now. They're prioritizing their own interests in order to regain control over documents against the proper procedures of the United States. Now, if we go back to the assassinations of the 1960s, and of course, there's an enormous amount of speculation about who was behind them. But, let's assume that it was, in fact, deep state operatives who were behind some of those assassinations. The key point to understand is, in that case, that was done covertly. It was not done by the FBI publicly turning up in vans and cars at the residence of the former president, marching in, rifling through the building for his papers, and even cracking his safe. I mean, that is an astonishing new departure. You say a precedent. I mean, it's an absolutely horrifying break with precedent. It's something that just doesn't happen, as far as I'm concerned, in a rules-based, law-based, constitutionally founded system. So if Americans are outraged, they have every right to be outraged. Before this program started, just before, you asked me, has anything like that happened in Britain? I've been searching my mind. Nothing like this has happened in Britain. If you go all the way back to the 17th century, to King Charles I coming along to the House of Commons to arrest the members there, well, arguably, in those days, he was acting still within his constitutional authorities. Obviously, subsequent to that, he changed, but you can't say that Charles I was acting illegally at that time, or the Wilkes prosecution of the 18th century, the idea of criminal libel against a journalist, which is often again cited as the state overreaching itself. Again, you can't talk about an institution, a group of people within the state using its institutions against itself in that kind of way. This is what's happened in America. Now, can I say the nearest approximation to my mind is Charles I coming to the House of Commons with an armed posse to arrest a number of members of Parliament because he wasn't happy with the kind of questions and investigations that they were launching into his personal monarchy. And what did that provoke? It provoked a civil war. Now, I'm not saying, I'm hoping this isn't where we are in the United States. I don't believe this is where we are in the United States. But that event in England was, if you like, an event which was seen as so shocking that it provoked an enormous political crisis. This event that we've just seen is similarly shocking, but it violates precedent, in my opinion, even more fundamentally than what Charles I did all the way back in the 1640s. So, this is just off the scale. And as I say, we're not talking about just a deep state anymore. We're talking about a state within the state. In other words, in effect, what the English used to refer to as an overmighty subject, a group of people who operate not just beyond the Constitution in some respects, beyond the accepted laws of the country, but who now consider themselves to be above those laws and more powerful than the constitutional systems of the nation, of the United States, of the Republic. And that, as I said, is an incredibly dangerous place for any country to be.
No doubt. It's a nation of corrupt men rather than a nation of honest law. And you mentioned the Charles I example. Those examples in the UK that happened in England way back are part of the reason why in our Constitution there's speech and immunities protection for members of Congress. They can't be arrested for what they say on the House and Senate floor. Can't even be sued for what they say on the House and Senate floor. Presidential immunity from both suit and criminal investigations during a criminal case, as an example. I mean, during their presidency. And if you look at the few examples that happen in other countries, Chirac in France, Netanyahu in Israel, it happens while they're in power by a low-level prosecutor holding them up, not them going after their political opponent using the highest and most powerful federal law enforcement agency in the world. The only place you see these, as Trump called it, third world countries, but also fascist nations, communist nations, totalitarian nations, that's the only place you see these kind of show trials and show proceedings. And, we'll get to later one that happened vis-a-vis a very prominent critic of the deep state in America and the surveillance state and the military-industrial complex, Alex Jones, once again, the canary in the coal mine for the weaponization of the legal system, because right after they got away with his trial, that all of a sudden they do this to Trump. Maybe somebody got a little confident. And then it turns out the federal magistrate who signed this, and this is, I have always had problems with the way we do search warrants in America in terms of procedurally. Constitutionally, we have robust protections. We have good rules under the federal rules of criminal procedure for motions to return seized property, for example, which if Trump wants to highlight some issues related to these documents, he could bring a motion for return of seized properties, get some things on file. But the biggest problem, the reason why the judiciary doesn't act as an effective gatekeeper of core liberties and rights, as is reflected in the Alex Jones kind of kangaroo proceedings that took place there, literally scripted for a movie crew that was filming it. We'll get into that. But is because of their own incapacity to meaningfully utilize their tasks and obligations and duties to protect liberty. They protect power more often than they protect liberty. And that is where here apparently a federal magistrate was the only one who reviewed the warrant, as far as what we know so far. I've always opposed that. Federal magistrates don't go through the approval process in the Senate. They're hired by the local judiciary, effectively. And usually they're political hacks and mediocre minds who just play the... And the thing is, if you're a magistrate, you're only there for 10 years. You want to get reappointed. You want to get it bounced up to the district court. Or at a minimum, you want to get bonus points in the big corporate legal world. That gives you no incentive to go after the FBI, the second guess the CIA or the NSA or any of the law enforcement agencies that are involved in these cases. That there's just no incentive to say, hold on a second, I need to re-review this. Are you doing this here? Have you complied with internal rules? Have you looked at alternatives, etc.? All of which was relevant here. That you're in a highly politically sensitive case. The Attorney General has to sign off himself in the United States, so that means Garland had to sign off on this warrant. Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, had to sign off on this. High-ranking people right underneath him both also had to sign off on this independently and separately, kind of like the FISA warrants that went into the Russiagate stuff. And by the way, we're seeing the same excuse. They're saying, oh, there must have been real high probable cause of criminal behavior, or otherwise all these high-ranking people and federal judges wouldn't have signed off. That was exactly the excuse for the Russiagate bogus warrants. So we know that's nonsense. And as someone who's been doing criminal defense law in the federal arena for the better part of a quarter century in the United States, that's always been garbage. But it's usually my friends on the left that were more aware of it than my friends on the right, because of just who practices certain areas of law. But in this case, a magistrate was the only one to sign it. What I've often said is the FBI could blow a leaf across most federal magistrates' desk and they'd sign it. To steal from Earl Long talking about O.K. Allen and all that jazz back in Louisiana back in the day. And we see it here. But it turns out this particular magistrate has a long-standing ties as the defense lawyer and part of, beyond just being the defense lawyer, the world of a certain man that was also prominent in Palm Beach. A man who was outed in part, according to investigative reports, by Trump that led to his initial investigation, and that was the one, the only, Jeffrey Epstein. So what's the chances the judge who signs off on this unprecedented warrant just happens to be the private lawyer, long-term lawyer for Jeffrey Epstein? I mean, this case gets getting wilder and wilder and wilder. Well, Christopher Wray was running off to vacation, so nobody could reach him. He testified in Congress just last week and had to leave early for his private jet out of town, knowing that this was going to be coming right down the pipeline, having to know it because he had to sign off. So it has all the fingerprints of deep state operatives. It didn't comply with the law as far as I can tell. You're supposed to resort to compliance. You're supposed to resort to subpoenas. Even if this was criminally compelling information, which it absolutely was not, You would have to go through all those protocols and procedures. It's not clear to me that they did or could have done so. And so it's a terrifying day for the rule of law in America, and hopefully a great awakening day for a lot of institutional conservatives, that it's time to purge the deep state of its pernicious power, which, as you note, has become a state of its own, a rogue state within a state that has co-opted the American democracy for its own pernicious purposes. And it might explain in part why we're in so many insane places around the world risking global war with both nuclear powers at the moment. I never thought that would happen in lifetime, but by golly, we've achieved it. And we didn't even achieve that during the Soviet Sino days. But we've done it now. And so maybe it's not just the fact we have a dementia candidate in the White House. We have a state that has literally effectively staged a coup over American constitutional democracy to such a degree they can get federal judges and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to do their bidding against the law and against the will of the American people.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the former president of the United States, perhaps the most prominent political figure in the United States, other than the president himself, the current president, perhaps even more prominent, perhaps even better known amongst Americans than the current incumbent president. If you're going to come along and say, well, you know, this person has got some documents that he's not releasing, and we need these documents back, you go through a whole contested process. You go through open court. You have legal battles. You first of all contact him. You don't just come along before any magistrate that you can find, get him to sign off on some documents and warrant or other, and send, as I said, the FBI round 30 agents and have them cracking safes open. I mean, this is absolute, as you said, banana republic stuff, not just banana republic stuff. It's the sort of thing that does happen in totalitarian systems. I mean, it beggars belief that this has happened. And to say that, a magistrate signed it off like that is not to respect procedure. It is to abuse procedure. Legal procedures are not there in order to expedite raids on people. They're not there to expedite raids against former presidents of the United States who are, to be straightforward, he's not going to run away. He's not going to go to Brazil with all his papers. Where's the urgency? Where's the panic here? I mean, why do you need to rush in to his residence and seize his papers in this kind of fashion? The first thing you do is you ask for them. Then if he won't give them, you subpoena him. If you then he won't, then you have contested hearings. Then after a legal process, that's when you start turning up at his door. But, you do none of these things. You can't just come along and say, well, a magistrate signed it off and that's okay then. Because, of course, it's not. It's just twisting certain aspects of the procedural system in order ultimately to negate the law and the protections the law provides and the protections that the Constitution itself provides. It's to use certain procedural devices to challenge the Constitution and the law and the immunities that flow from the Constitution and the law. And I would say that is clearly abusive and ultimately illegal in itself. I mean, I have to say, I never imagined that we would get to this point in the United States. I say that I never imagined it a few years ago. I've become increasingly concerned and skeptical about where we are in the United States and the kind of things that are happening in the United States. But even a year ago, 2 years ago, I would have said this couldn't possibly happen. That there would, at the very least, be a contested hearing before FBI agents started to turn up at Donald Trump's door and started breaking into his safe in that kind of way. Now, I mean, obviously, it's a terrible mistake. It's an egregious wrong, but it does speak of desperation. And, Robert, you've given some very plausible explanations as to why they might have done this, that, there may be all kinds of hidden bombs hidden amongst these papers, and I'm entirely willing to believe that as well. I can't help but think also that there is absolute terror that this man, Donald Trump, that they worked so hard to prevent him becoming president. And then when he became president, they worked so hard to undermine him as president. And then when it looked like he might win the election, they worked so hard to prevent him winning the election that he might, horror upon horror, be back and stronger than he has ever been before. And this time with a much better team behind him, and might start doing things, some of the kind of things that perhaps he should have done when he was president himself, but didn't do. So it's desperation from every side, and desperate people do more and more reckless things. And this looks extremely reckless to me, and increasingly dangerous things. And again, I have to say, it does remind me a little bit of Charles I coming to arrest the members, because by this point, Charles felt that his position was weakening, his political position was crumbling, and so he thought that he could launch some kind of great strike against his enemies. And of course, all it did was that it caused the whole thing to fall apart around him. And that is how this looks to me.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, to the super chat question, that does it feel like what it did in the 60s? I mean, we went in the early 1962, American public opinion overwhelmingly believed in American institutions of power. The medical institutions, the media institutions, the political institutions, the FBI. There were TV shows on, partially thanks to J. Edgar Hoover, who has, he liked to dress up in many ways, but he did always like to dress up as if he was doing the law when they took actions, and kept his illicit activities covert in the closet, so to speak. And so that institution was very popular, military very popular, a lot of confidence, even Congress and other institutions. After the 4 assassinations, both Kennedy brothers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, within a 5-year time frame, that collapsed. And then the final collapse was the removal of Nixon, because that spread doubt in wider range of circles as to what's really going on out there. And that, of course, led to the Church Committee, led to the House Committee on Assassinations, led to MK Ultra exposure, led to the exposure about coups around the world. The reason why we know as much led to the Freedom of Information Act, led to the Privacy Act, led to these institutional reforms and major evidentiary hearings that are why we know as much about the deep state that we do today. That exposed, COINTELPRO at the FBI, so on and so forth. And of course, the man who ran COINTELPRO at the FBI, who was supposed to be elevated to the FBI after Hoover, was actually Deep Throat. Right? Deep Throat was not some conscientious, honest, objective. It was a deep state hack trying to take out the president, because why? That president didn't appoint him personally head of the FBI. That's how bad it had got. But from the Dulles brothers. But as you note, at least that was almost all covert and hidden, not open and overt. And that's a shocking sign when it shifts to that, because it's an assertion of raw power in the name of the law that the law is supposed to prohibit and prevent them from having. Now, Mark Elias, a big Democratic lawyer, hitman lawyer, ran a lot of the election litigation that led to the election fornication of 2020, to be appropriate here on YouTube. I think fortification is how I think Time called it. Was out there saying that, hey, we can use this law to keep President Trump from even being ever being reelected again. Now, that's a complete misreading of the law. There is a federal law that says if you willfully, intentionally, criminally steal a document that does not, in fact, belong to you, that you do not have the right to, and so forth, then there's a federal crime that's prosecutable, and that under that, you cannot be an officer of the United States if you're convicted. However, that doesn't apply to the elected offices, and the reason is the U.S. Constitution is, as the Supreme Court has already adjudicated, the exclusive means for determining both qualifications and holding office. So Congress cannot add to that. State legislatures cannot add to that. State governors cannot add to that. So you just have to be a citizen, natural-born citizen of the United States and 35 years of age, and that's it. to be president. And the only way to prevent that is by the impeachment and removal process, which in my view requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate, which they never obtained the first time around. So this law cannot be used, as some are believing and speculating, and Mark Elias is suggesting, in order to remove or prevent Trump from running for office. There's nothing that Trump could run for the presidency, as Eugene Debs did, while in prison. So we have historical precedent for that. So they can't stop him from getting to the presidency, no matter what they do, in lieu of a health problem or him dying. And so it does also suggest, some of us had thought this might have happened at the time, as to what, like a lot of us were surprised. There are people very close to Trump that we were part of the team that wrote the memo to pardon Julian Assange. So that was the priority. Edward Snowden was secondary. And Trump had mixed views on Snowden. He was more sympathetic with Assange. And we all believed he was going to do it. And then he didn't do that, didn't do Snowden, and pardoned some other people that were kind of sketchy, that got, paid off the CPAC founder and some other people to lobby for him, stuff like that. And then didn't declassify stuff. And we're like, why did he choose not to, when he was really committed to all that? Well, one explanation on the not declassifying is that Trump was holding that information for himself and held it as insurance against future actions by the deep state, administrative state, whatever you want to call it. And that he has it secured in independent documentary form, that he has it secured in multiple people who have that information in case anything happens to him, and that everybody knows if they actually indict him, then he can publicly disclose it. And so this raid would suggest that theory that some people believe Trump was doing, some people may have even, hypothetically speaking, advised Trump along those terms, that he actually did do so. And that part of this may not just be to seize information. They may not want to indict Trump unless they know he doesn't have this documentary independent proof available to expose something bad about them in formalized official proceedings. Whatever it is, it must be awfully damning to do an unprecedented, unparalleled raid on the ex-president of the United States and the likely future president of the United States again. But at least there's been a good political and public blowback, and so hopefully there's enough of that. But coming on the top of the Alex Jones show trial, where they're trying to disguise something about being about a school shooting, when it's really about saying, if you question institutional narratives, if you advance so-called conspiracy theories, then you should be able to be sued into bankruptcy and oblivion, financially punished to where you can't speak anymore. Makes it doubly disconcerting and disturbing for those of us that care about civil liberties and civil rights in America.
Just a few quick points. I think Mark Elias needs to be extremely careful what he says, because if he's going around saying, you can use the criminal law in this kind of fashion in order to prevent Donald Trump standing for president. One, based on what you're saying, Robert, and I'm absolutely sure you're right. I mean, that makes complete sense to me. Why have an impeachment process otherwise? He's wrong. So that's already a dangerous mistake for him to start making. But secondly, of course, it completely exposes what this is partly about. I'm not saying this is the motivation of the people who ordered the raid, but from the perspective of some people, they will say, well, look, what the Democrats are doing, they're not really interested in any of Donald Trump's transgressions. They're not really concerned about whether Donald Trump's committed any crimes. They're simply there to stop him running. And that's not what the law should be used for. That is a further abuse of law. And that not only will damage the institutions of the United States, the FBI, the Justice Department, and the rest, by making them look like political tools of the Democrats, it will damage the Democrats, because people will say, well, the Democrats can't beat Trump in a fair fight. So they're now using the institutional organs of the United States to prevent him running. Now, that's what they're going to be saying in response to the kind of things that Mark Elias is saying. So I think that he also is making a big political mistake by saying the kind of things that he's saying. I think it's, if you like, a dropping of the mask. It shows the extent to which the Democrats, to be straightforward about this, are frightened of Donald Trump. And I think that Mark Elias, as a lawyer, to the extent that he continues to have any continued loyalty to the law, which is a law he should do, he should be amongst those protesting against this abuse of law, not supporting it. And he should be protesting against it for political reasons as well. You should be following what the White House is doing and saying, we have had absolutely nothing to do with this. We think this is a mistake. We think this is wrong. We are not supporting this at all. But anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Mark Elias. Now, Alex Jones, there was a very famous case in Britain about 20, 30 years ago. And that involved a person, a historian, whose name was Tolstoy, and he was actually a member of the Tolstoy family. And he wrote a book about a former minister of the British government, in which that he said that this minister of the British government had colluded with the Soviets to have Cossack soldiers who fought with the Germans repatriated, deported to the Soviet Union, where Stalin had them all executed. Anyway, that was what this person, this historian Tolstoy, said. And he was sued in defamation by the minister, this government minister, who was still alive at that time. He'd obviously become retired. And the government minister won. And I think he was awarded damages in the High Court. I think there was something like £1 million. And there was an enormous legal battle. And it went all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights quashed the award because it said that this award was clearly disproportionate and excessive, and its true purpose was not to compensate this minister for any defamation, but to silence the historian, and was therefore an infringement of free speech. It was an Article 10 infringement. Now, it seems to me that what we have in the United States is, I'm not familiar with all the details of this case, but a $45 million award, how can that possibly be anything else than an attempt to silence Alex Jones? I mean, it is off the scale. And I was reading just the other day in The Guardian, liberal newspaper in Britain, and they were commenting on some of the things that the judge in this Alex Jones case said to Alex Jones. And Alex Jones said, I've never said anything that I believed was untrue. And the judge came back and said, what you, Alex Jones, don't seem to understand is that what you believe is true isn't necessarily true. Well, if that's the case, then Alex Jones is not a liar, because The Guardian was saying that the judge was calling him a liar. And of course, if Alex Jones says something which he believes is true, then he cannot be a liar, because a lie is something which somebody says with the intention of deceiving people, either being knowing it to be untrue or reckless as to whether it is true or not. So the judge comes up with this comment, which I have to say I thought was incredibly prejudicial. And why is a judge making a comment like that anyway? So we have things that the judge says which I don't think are appropriate at all for a judge to say in a case like this. And an award which is just off the scale, and which, as I said, there is British and European court precedent for saying that it's dangerous, that it looks like an attempt to restrict, to suppress speech, the exercise of free speech, which the European Court of Human Rights said is an obvious and important human right.
No doubt. I mean, so first as to the case itself and what its significance is, the media has tried to spin it as being about Alex Jones, about being about Sandy Hook, about being compliance with the law, so on and so forth. But that media narrative is mostly inaccurate. And in fact, we don't have to question what their motivation was because the plaintiff's lawyers laid it out in closing argument during the punitive damages stage of the case, where, by the way, Alex Jones wasn't allowed to defend himself in that part either. Wasn't even allowed to present any evidence, any witnesses. Court banned it. Where what the plaintiff's lawyer said is to the jury, here's what you're here to do. Take him out. The exact words. Take him out. If Alex Jones had said that, they would have put him in prison someplace. They went further and explained by paraphrasing, issue a verdict that not only will take him off the air now, but will not allow him to ever be on the air again. And that will not allow anyone like him to be on the air again. And if you want to know what they meant by like him, you had jurors who asked questions, very unusual, but the judge allowed it in this case, saying, could we use this against people who deny elections? And the media saying, could we use this against people who raise questions about vaccines? Could we use this against people who lie about foreign governments and foreign policies? Right? I mean, we can all see where this is heading. And before I go into the details of all the constitutional rights that were violated in terms of due process, freedom of speech, right to counsel, right to confrontation of witnesses, right to trial by jury, if there was a right that could be violated, it was in the Alex Jones case. If there was a rule that could be a rule of evidence, a rule of process that could be eviscerated, it was in the Alex Jones case. And it made a complete mockery out of the idea of judicial neutrality. This judge was openly partisan and very public interpartisanship allowed. Everything was literally scripted for a movie that's actually being made in the courtroom. 3 movie cameras in the courtroom, including one looking down the jury the entire time, because the Leaving Neverland production crew is making a movie based on the trial, which makes them legally immune as long as the judge made sure the trial went to script. As long as the Alex Jones wasn't allowed to present a defense, but a bunch of inflammatory evidence that wasn't relevant was allowed in, they could rebroadcast that in a film, and Jones can't sue, even if it's complete libel, because they're just repeating what took place in court under American law. But before we go to those details, to step back for those people that may not know of Alex Jones, half of America doesn't, or have some caricature of Alex Jones. Why Alex Jones? You know, what distinguished Alex Jones was not raising questions about school shootings. What is distinct about Alex Jones is he's the most significant populist voice in America, and definitely the most significant voice on the right, that challenged the first Iraq war, that challenged the second Iraq war, that challenged wars in Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan, that challenged Trump on bombing Syria, that challenged Trump on various war-related activities, that was the number one defender on the right of Julian Assange, the number one defender on the right of Edward Snowden, the number one person on the right critical of the national security state, the number one person critical of the lockdowns, of the mask and vaccine mandates, of Bill Gates' public health agenda, the number one critic of the deep state writ large. And he's had more success in getting that message shared amongst Americans than any American in American history. He is the equal to today to what Thomas Paine was at the time of the American Revolution. That's why they're targeting Alex Jones. They're not targeting Alex Jones because they're really upset over a copyright or they're really upset over Sandy Hook. Indeed, most of what was said about him concerning Sandy Hook also wasn't true. This was why they couldn't allow this into the trial. Over 99% of the statements broadcast or published by InfoWars said Sandy Hook happened. It raised questions about other aspects, the complicity of Big Pharma and SSRI drugs that so many young men are taking when they commit these horrible crimes, the inadequacy of American medical care and psychological care for young men especially over the past 20 years, the inadequacy of school safety measurements and other aspects that in fact was deep here because in Sandy Hook, politicians lied and kids died. They didn't have the basic means to lock the doors. An issue that came up recently in Uvalde. If the teachers had been able to lock the inside of the doors, a bunch of kids would likely be alive today. They had to cover that up because you can imagine what would have happened to those politicians at the time if that got publicly exposed, since that was a school safety requirement since Columbine. So instead, they suppressed that information, hid that information, blamed the gun, destroyed a lot of evidence along the way that triggered suspicions that led people in the completely wrong direction. And Alex Jones admitted he had made mistakes about Sandy Hook. He got things wrong about Sandy Hook, but he never talked about the parents by name ever. And in America, under the New York Times versus Sullivan decision, it's called constitutional requirement of colloquium. It means you can only sue in America for defamation, libel, or intentional infliction of emotional distress or speech, period, regardless of the nomenclature of the cause of action. If you say a specifically false fact, can't be a non-factual opinion, about a specifically identified individual. And if it's if you don't name the person and you don't show a visual of the person, then it has to be in a small enough group that they know it's you. So this goes back to a famous New York case where two people had libeled, two different groups had libeled two different parts of Macy's. One part they had said it about, I think it was like men's suits, and there was only like 8 workers there. And the court said, okay, that's a sufficient number of numbers that when you said all the men's suit salesmen are fraudsters, that they can sue because there's only 8 of them, so that probably means people think it's about you, George Jones, the salesman. They also said it, I think, about like the women's cosmetics department or something, and there were like 100 workers in there. And the New York court said, no, that's too many people. They can't know it was about you. There's 100 people there. It's too broad. So that's always been the distinction, has been what's called the rule of 25 in America, defamation law. I know this very well because I represented a bunch of the Covington kids, and we were underneath that. They've been identified by image, etc. But we had to meet those thresholds in order to even bring suit. And by the way, Nicholas Salmon's suit was thrown out in court under standards that never would have allowed the Alex Jones case to go to trial. So we're seeing wild disparity, which is another problem with the Trump raid. You can't let Hunter Biden run around committing crimes in every state he's in, now hanging out in Venice Beach, and then go after the president because you're not sure that the archives have the right records. You can't do this kind of disparity. But the same thing with Jones. So that constitutional requirement of colloquium would say they didn't have a case in the first place. Then you looked at the underlying facts and you realized most of the things Infowars ever said are not what they're complaining about. That also completely gutted their case. And then their whole theory of the case was that Alex Jones only became famous and only made money because he made these very sporadic, occasional, rare comments about Sandy Hook that are the grounds for the suit. Of course, Alex Jones lost money related to Sandy Hook. He was famous for things nothing to do with Sandy Hook. And so those were all lies. So one of the things they did during the discovery stage of the case is they said, give us the proof of your guilt. And he's like, I'm not guilty. I'm innocent. I didn't do this. There is no evidence of my guilt because I'm not guilty. I didn't make money off of this. I don't have secret analytics and marketing plans and business. I don't have any of this. And the court said, you are insisting you're innocent. We hereby declare you by default to be guilty because you didn't turn over the evidence of your guilt, even though you don't actually have that evidence of guilt. Because it's like what the judge said in the little Orwellian, 2 + 2 = 5. We're going to keep trying until you get this right. Come on, let's try, Winston, one more time. That's what the judge's reference was like. People even quoted that aspects of her statements in the proceedings paralleled almost word for word words that the Nazis said in the 1930s about misinformation and so forth. It's the same exact logic. But as some people pointed out, even a Soviet show trial tried to actually be a show of quality that made you believe maybe there was justice there. There was none of that with this judge. Anybody who watched it was like, holy moly. People were even cheering her on social media that hate Alex Jones, saying, look at how she's going after Alex Jones. Woohoo! That's not the role of a judge in America. So they had to gut the First Amendment. They had to make up rules about discovery. They had to make up facts about the case. They had to deny him any ability to present evidence in his own defense because if the evidence was fully known, they knew that the great American legal process, an adversarial process where everybody gets their day in court, where both sides are fully heard, where you can have confidence you heard the best argument for both sides. They could not allow that to happen, even in front of a liberal, democratic, Austin authoritarian jury pool. And Austin's one of the worst jury pools in the country for Alex Jones, even though it's his hometown because it's gone in a very different direction, big tech influence, so on and so forth. It's not weird, hip, cool Willie Nelson Austin. It's Google Austin. That's what it is now. and is that even that jury pool would not come back with the size verdicts that they wanted and needed. That they might not even come back and rule against Alex Jones at all. When we tested it, over half of American juries were ruling in favor of Alex Jones when they heard the actual facts. When they heard that the people suing him had never even timely filed a notice of request for correction, retraction, or apology. By the way, he wasn't allowed to present, even though Texas substantive law says he's legally entitled to, evidence of the fact that he apologized. Wasn't allowed to present evidence that he was innocent. Wasn't allowed to present evidence that he didn't say the things that they were accusing of. Wasn't allowed to present evidence that he lost money on all of this. Wasn't allowed to present any of the evidence, nor was he, most importantly, allowed to present evidence of all the times Alex Jones was right. They couldn't let that in. Though they did make one mistake. The most mimetic moment of the trial came when the plaintiff's lawyer said, "You believe that there's these sex trafficking rings out there involving politicians and don't you?" And Jones was like, "You mean Jeffrey Epstein and the Clintons?" Which has now gone mean. There's like a Rogan version of it. There's a Thug Life version of it. There's like, that's what everybody's going to remember. They couldn't afford that to be the whole trial. That's why they suppressed everything, censored it, allowed in evidence that had no relevance. They played a bit from me talking about the trial being scripted, took out just a 5-second part of it, wouldn't play the other beginning or the after of that, even though the evidentiary rules of completeness require that in America. And even though my statements about the court proceeding aren't relevant anyway, they presented Alex Jones's testimony, that things he had said about the jury outside the courtroom, also not relevant, not allowed in the courtroom. So it was the worst joke of a kangaroo court I've ever witnessed, the worst version of a show trial in the history of America. Closest parallel you could get is the Chicago 7 case back in the late 1960s when they went after those dissidents as well. But even they were allowed more of a defense than Alex Jones was afforded. It was 1984 on steroids. But the biggest, scariest thing is they want to use it as a precedent at two levels: a precedent to suppress dissident speech in America, and a precedent that they can eviscerate the rule of law and nobody will do anything about it as long as their target is controversial enough. And it should be, as one of the super chatters said, what happens to Trump can happen to you. What happens to Alex Jones will happen to you.
Yeah.
That's been the guarantee in the past.
This is absolutely true. Robert, just one thing which I haven't understood. How was this absolutely astonishing award compensate? Where did it come from? Is this the jury coming up with this figure? That's what used to happen in England, by the way, under the old defamation law, that it was the jury that used to come up with these figures. That I've never heard of a $45 million award ever in my life in any kind of defamation claim. But was it the jury or was it the judge? Because this, even if I know nothing about Alex Jones, and I know I know a certain amount about him, and I know that he's been a dissident voice on the right, but even I know nothing about him, about the facts of the case, an award on that scale seems to me so completely off the scale that would in itself have raised alarm bells to me. So who has actually decided on this award? And bear in mind what I said about that British case that went to the European Court of Human Rights, and they said that this is clearly an award not intended to compensate someone for damage to their reputation. It's clearly an award intended to suppress free speech. Who actually came up with this figure? Was it the jury? Was it the judge?
The jury, by request of the plaintiff's counsel. So they were seeking, for example, this was another one of the crazy violations that took place in this case, was in the jury selection process. The jury was asked, in a question that in every courtroom I've ever been in is completely impermissible, would they commit in advance of hearing the evidence to awarding $100 million just for emotional injury, even if there's no evidence of medical injury, no evidence of physical injury, no evidence of economic injury, $100 million. And if you said no, you were excluded from the jury. And again, this size verdict has never happened in the history of the United States of America for a claim like this. Never happened. So they were requesting the jury. Only way you could sit on the jury is if you were already biased in favor of an insane award. The second premise question was you had to believe that the media had never said anything false about Alex Jones in his history. This is a guy who's been libeled about almost as much as Donald Trump. And people believe things that he never said. They believe things about him he never did, so on and so forth. And that was the other precondition to get it. Was already a liberal Democratic jury pool. They just made sure they got the most crazy authoritarians on there. But what they asked for was 150 million. They wanted 150 million a pop per person because there's other people suing in Texas and Connecticut in cases to come. So they wanted over $1 billion, and they explained real clear why. I mean, it wasn't about punishing him for what he did. It wasn't for deterrence from doing that again, because it wasn't even tied to that. It was don't let Alex take him out, and take out people like him. We're going to use it as a precedent. The plaintiff's lawyer, even afterwards in a press conference, was comparing him and InfoWars to a corpse that they were going to cut up and cannibalize. This is the mind. I mean, to hear that being said, and in the middle of all this, they stole his attorney-client records. So they as you know, Alex and Alexander, lawyers turn over information by accident every day in America. It's the nature of digital world. Technology, you put in the wrong email address. I get it all the time. I've never been on the side of sending it to anybody, but I've been on the side of receiving it. And professionally and ethically, our obligation is to not look at it, destroy any records we have of it, send it back, end of story. That's not what plaintiff's lawyer did by his own admission in court. He stole Alex Jones's attorney-client records, knew he wasn't supposed to have them, knew Alex Jones didn't consent to giving him. Only the client can waive attorney-client privilege. An attorney can't by inadvertence or intentionally, and bragged about it in court, and then lied and said Alex Jones committed perjury, completely false, completely bogus. And the next thing he did is he turned it over to anybody who wanted it. He's sending it over to random people. I mean, these are pictures of Alex Jones's wife and things like this, sending it to whomever wants it. Private communications, attorney-client communications, all protected under the 4th or 6th Amendment, as the case may be. And this was on top of Alex Jones being denied in these different court proceedings rights to bring motions to dismiss, rights to bring anti-SLAPP motions, rights to bring summary judgment motions, rights to appeal many of those motions. His out-of-court speech was used as grounds to deny him stuff. I mean, things that have just never happened in the history of America. All of them happened collectively in just these set of Sandy Hook cases. But that's the scale and scope to which they were willing to just infringe and violate any of it. And the jury aspect was just the last aspect. They want to take him out, and then next is all the rest of us. Just like when they took him out on social media in August of 2018, some of us said, we're all next on the chopping block. And who do they come for next? Ultimately, the biggest name, the President of the United States that they took off of social media. Now they do a joke kangaroo court, which has a bunch of conservative judges, conservative institutional folks keeping their mouths shut or even praising this wrongful persecution of Alex Jones. And again, you can completely not care at all about Alex Jones. You can hate him all you want. You should be terrified of what happened to him because of what it means about the disregard and disrespect for the rule of law and constitutional rights, particularly free speech in this space. That's why Glenn Greenwald came down for the new documentary, Alex's War, and sat down with Alex and said very positive things about Alex at the end of that proceeding. It's why Kim Iverson is saying this is a threat to all independent speech. It's why a lot of people that oppose Alex on a range of topics, libertarians, liberals, conservatives, have come out and said this is an outrage. The ones paying attention, Mike Cernovich, Michael Malice, Charles Kirk, Jack Posobiec, so on and so forth. But a lot of your institutional types are not saying anything because they're just buying the media regurgitated narrative, or they just hate Alex Jones, or down deep, they're on the side of the deep state wanting to suppress and silence probably their most important critic and dissident inside the United States. They want to lock up Julian Assange, and they want to take out Alex Jones. And then it's no surprise their next step was to raid the house of the ex-president of the United States.
Robert, the things you've just been saying to me, if I let my jaw drop, it will be shattering against the floor. I mean, the things that you've discussed are astonishing. First of all, feeding to a jury when it's selected the idea that you can, award these absolutely staggering sums. I mean, insane sums. That is already, to my mind, ludicrously prejudicial. I've already mentioned one comment of this judge that I saw in The Guardian, which it struck me again. Why is a judge commenting about things like that? After all, decisions of fact, as far as I know, about a person's honesty or not, are matters for the jury. not for the judge to comment about, not in that kind of way. That again struck me as incredibly prejudicial. But that lawyers should have been circulating privileged documents of one of the parties in the case, and the judge did nothing. The judge allowed it.
And the judge and said, go ahead, send it to whoever you want. I mean, that's how nuts it was. And it's because they got accustomed early on to doing any crazy thing they wanted. In Connecticut, it's not only politics, but it's because of Sandy Hook. The courts are all terrified. That's why they approved a suit against gun manufacturers that's patently illegal under federal law. Didn't matter. Ultimately, the insurance companies wrote a $77 million check to some of these same plaintiffs. And they're getting money over and over and over again. And at some point, but they keep blaming the people that aren't the real primary principal culprits of what took place. But it's because they were able to do anything. I mean, the Connecticut court, the judge Alex Jones had been critical out of court on his own show about what the other lawyers were doing because they were lying about what had happened. What happened is illicit materials. Somebody was spamming, trying to plant illegal materials on InfoWars computers by sending it through their emails. They had never opened it up. Because of Discovery, and for those people that still don't think Alex Jones participated in Discovery, he sat for more depositions. InfoWars sat for more depositions. They turned over more documents than in any comparable case I've ever heard of. You're talking about 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 14 depositions when you start aggregating them. You're talking about millions of pages of documents and information to such a degree they have photos of his wife and things like this in the Discovery. But part of it was they turned over everything that got sent to their junk email. They even turned that over because they're like, okay, we'll give everything. Keep giving everything. And in there was this illicit materials. The plaintiff's lawyers and the media went out and lied and said, Alex Jones sends illegal materials to the Sandy Hook families. Utterly false. He got upset about that for obvious reasons. Says so on air. The court in Connecticut says, I don't like your statements outside of the courtroom. I'm hereby denying you all rights to bring motions to dismiss, all rights to bring anti-SLAPP motions, all rights to bring any motion on the law and the legal merits to test the case, all of it. Connecticut Supreme Court goes along with it because they don't like that. There's an Alex Jones exception to everything. To the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Seventh Amendment, you name it. There's now an Alex Jones exception to the rule of completeness, the rule of hearsay, the rule of third-party admissions, the rules of relevance, the rules of materiality, the rules of undue confusion, the rules of unfair prejudice, all of it, rules of due process, rules of summary judgment, rules of punitive damages, right to mitigate damages, right to notice, etc. And the problem is, once you carve out an Alex Jones exception, it's like when we started carving out drug exceptions to the Fourth Amendment and drug exceptions or mob exceptions to the Fourth and Fifth and Sixth. Sooner or later, they're applying those to all the rest of us. That's what they're doing now. Alex Jones exceptions to all the law so that they can stick us into the Alex Jones exception and screw us, not only on speech, but on the right to just our day in court.
Absolutely. Can I just say, so these are core protections. Everything that you've just been talking about are core protections. Most of them, the greater part of them, perhaps even all of them, have histories that extend back before the Constitution of the United States. They are part of the actual creation of law. I mean, to give an example, because I've actually studied this whole topic, client-attorney privilege, the earliest case, the earliest full precedent case, goes back to the 16th century, to a case heard in the English courts in the days of Queen Elizabeth I. And, it's actually, it's a full statement there of client-attorney privilege and what it means. And the judges in that case were already speaking about this as something that had already existed basically since time immemorial. So you're throwing all that out in order to get to someone, well, you're basically throwing out the whole law, because it's not just, the law of the United States that's involved. It's the whole concept of law as it exists in any civilized country. Now, can I just ask straight away, Robert, I mean, presumably he's going to appeal. Where is he going to appeal to? Is this because, given the fact that we're talking about violations of fundamental protections, Is this a case that could go to the Supreme Court of the United States? I always ask you these questions about these sort of cases because I always have difficulty sometimes understanding the legal processes, the appeal processes in the United States. But presumably he's going to appeal. Whom is he going to appeal to? Is he going to appeal to the Supreme Court of the of the state where this trial took place? If that doesn't work, can he take it further? Will it go all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States? What will happen?
Well, it will be different cases, different places, so different appeal processes, and there's now a federal bankruptcy court involved. So he's still facing another case before that same judge in Texas. He's facing a case in Connecticut where, by the way, FBI, people think it's parents suing him. In some of these cases, it's not just parents. It's an FBI guy is suing Alex Jones for causing him trauma for second guessing how the FBI responded to the case. That's how, and imagine where that goes. If that guy gets that precedent through, we can't challenge anything. All of a sudden, all of us can be sued because, hey, you challenged how the FBI handled something. You caused me intentional infliction of emotional distress. You libeled me. I get to sue you in oblivion in the politically correct court. That's how crazy these cases are. But so those cases would go through different appellate processes. This current case that was just adjudicated, its judgment is stayed pending the bankruptcy. Now, in Texas, you can also bond a judgment. In Connecticut, you have an automatic stay pending appeal. In Texas, you don't, but as long as the judgment substantively ends up under $25 million, and under Texas punitive damages laws, they have to bring down that $45 million to about $1.5 million. So it ends up being like a $5-6 million judgment. And the plaintiff's lawyers were lying about the case to get maximum publicity, to try to scare other people. I better not be like Alex Jones or question the wrong people, or they'll whack me politically and financially like they did him. So that will go to the Texas Court of Appeals. The problem is Texas divides its Court of Appeals so much that Austin has its own Court of Appeals. They're all elected. They're all liberal Democratic Austin judges. They are the ones that have been issuing one crazy decision after the next in the early stages of this case. Changing the definition of defamation, changing the constitutional requirement of colloquium, changing the definition of intentional infliction of emotional distress, such that you could intend to inflict emotional distress on someone you didn't even know. It's like, what, when? So you can intend to inflict, someone can suffer emotional distress who never even heard you say what they're suing over. I mean, those are some of the legal statements coming out of the courts. Statute of limitations, thrown out. Punitive damage notice requirements, thrown out. Apology rights, thrown out. All done by a lot of this was done by the Austin Court of Appeals. And some of the judges who wrote those opinions used what they wrote to run for Texas Supreme Court because the liberals love it so much in the authoritarian part of liberal Austin. So he doesn't face much positive prospects there. Where he does is the Texas Supreme Court. I was briefly involved in the case very early on, and at that stage, the Texas Supreme Court almost took the case up at the very beginning. And we just needed one more justice to say yes, and if they would have taken it, they would have gutted the whole case. If they do take it, they will reverse on everything. And they can reverse just on the constitutional requirement of colloquium, and now you even have to deal with all the other craziness. But you're right. There are very unique federal constitutional issues also implicated in this case, so that the U.S. Supreme Court could and absolutely should take the case if no one else does, because it goes to, like the U.S. Supreme Court established in a range of, in Brandenburg and a range of other decisions, that the protection of free speech even applies to certain incitement kind of acts, which is not what Alex Jones did anyway. They didn't really prove that at all at trial. That mythology was put to rest by their lack of plaintiff's evidence. But the other aspects are the out-of-court speech issue. That goes all the way back to Harry Bridges, the 1940s, labor strikes, the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, Harry Bridges said, court's issued a ruling, we're still going on strike, screw off. And the judge was like, well, screw you, you're in contempt. And he went to the U.S. Supreme Court and they said, that's out-of-court speech. You can't call that contempt. That's still protected. Same principle, even stronger, would apply in Alex Jones's case, who did nothing like what Harry Bridges did. You have the constitutional right of colloquium. You have the constitutional limits on intentional infliction of emotional distress. Two cases. Jerry Falwell, he sued Hustler because Hustler suggested that, he'd been with his mother. But it was Hustler, right? So he sues. He's like, I'm outraged. Got a big verdict. Like New York Times versus Sullivan. Last time this happened in 1950s, early 1960s, Deep South sheriffs decided we're going to use our local courts to shut up all these civil rights protesters and dissidents. They got like a $5 million crazy verdict, which is like $50 million a day. Same size was the New York Times versus Sullivan. Part of why the Supreme Court got in. They're like, woohoo, we can see what's going on here. Like what you're talking about, Alexander, in Europe. Oh, when it gets that big, we all know what's happening here. This is not about compensation. This is not about punitive damages. This is about suppressing and censoring dissident speech. So there's a bunch of grounds which the U.S. Supreme Court, Westboro Baptist, $77 million verdict. Those are the people who used to protest people at people's funerals. Talk about being mean. I mean, they did it at people's funerals. They said an idea is never illegal under American law. You can't sue over it. Sounds very analogous to Alex Jones's circumstances. So there's a great chance that the Texas Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court handles this. It's all complicated a little bit because there's a bankruptcy court. InfoWars itself filed for bankruptcy. Free Speech Systems is the entity that owns it. Give you an idea of the fake evidence in the case. An economist got up and said, InfoWars, I think it's probably worth $230 million. Is anybody, without Alex Jones, they don't have Alex Jones on contract, is anybody going to buy InfoWars for $230 million without Alex Jones? It's ludicrous. That's the kind of nonsense being issued from the stand in the name of expertise. But it's in bankruptcy. The bankruptcy court, the bankruptcy trustee, U.S. trustees work for the Biden administration. They've already shown themselves to be very politically prejudiced when aspects of this case were in bankruptcy earlier on. So he's got to deal with that issue. But if the bankruptcy court does its job, it should clean up a lot of this. But you're going to have potential rulings from the bankruptcy court, Texas Court of Appeals, Texas Supreme Court, and U.S. Supreme Court. Those are the only places where maybe the law actually gets applied. Texas Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, or bankruptcy court, so that maybe it gets restored so this precedent doesn't become a precedent they can use against the rest of us.
Absolutely. Can I just make one fundamental point about this case, which is that courts exist to uphold rights, including the right to free speech. They do not exist in order to extinguish rights. And that, if you don't understand that, if courts are out there to sort of suppress people, to prevent them, prevent people exercising their right of free speech, if that's what they see themselves as being there to do, well, they're not courts anymore. They're not upholding the law. They're not functioning within a legal process any longer. They become courts exactly like the ones that, Joseph Stalin used to have back in the 1930s in the Soviet Union, when, famously Vyshinsky, his special prosecutor, said, well, you don't bother about the law, you don't bother about the evidence. All you need to consider is the social and political context of the case and decide whether the criminal is guilty or innocent on that basis. I mean, that's where you're heading. If courts don't understand that, if judges don't understand that, then they're not courts or judges any longer. And I have to say, Robert, I mean, all that you've been telling me about this case, I mean, it makes my head spin. It sounds like this is a tragic situation. So don't misunderstand me, but it sounds like Monty Python justice. I mean, it really does. I mean, it is as absurd, as ludicrous as that.
Yeah,
what can I say?
Completely. And so we'll see and I don't think it's a coincidence, the timing. They're trying to take out Jones on the eve of whatever they're planning for this fall, because we've seen Afghanistan, their plans fell apart. Now we're seeing things fall apart in Ukraine. Go back to when, we haven't yet been distinguished enough to be put on the blacklist of Ukraine yet. But Senator Rand Paul managed to make it. I mean, can you imagine another government receiving billions and billions of dollars from us, putting one of our own senators on a blacklist hit list? One of our own members of the press and Glenn Greenwald on a blacklist hit list. On other people connected to Ron Paul being put on those lists. It's just insane that we're doing this. And I forgot until I watched the movie Lord of War that they actually had an inside version of Zelensky doing a map of Ukraine, when the brother who's the and this is all about Victor Bout. The movie was loosely a biography of Victor Bout, who's now the guy we're going to exchange to Russia for Brittany Griner. But in it, his brother gets hooked on cocaine, and so he does a whole map of Ukraine with cocaine. And I was like, that's basically Zelensky every single night in Kiev. So this is they're clearly up to stuff, and things are falling apart for them. Let's lash out on Alex Jones. Let's lash out on Donald Trump. A lot of them blame Alex Jones for the rise of Trump and the rise of suspicion of the FBI, suspicion of the CIA, suspicion of the NSA, especially amongst the populist right in America. Kind of the way they blame Thomas Paine, the Brits did, for aspects back in those days. So for his rabble-rousing in the taverns and what have you. So with Common Sense and other great texts. But so you look at what's happening in Ukraine, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert from Colorado, a lot of these people who've won, Paul Gosar, they won primary challenges. Now Joe Kent has won his, Blake Masters won his, J.D. Vance won his, Eric Schmidt was not as populist as he could have been, but has been more in that direction as the campaign proceeded in Missouri, and definitely more populist than one of the other alternatives other than Eric Greitens in the race. And so you've seen a lot of populist surge. Kerry Lake, very populist governor. You're seeing Governor DeSantis and future Governor Lake make very condemning statements of what the FBI did. Talk about this is a banana republic. That was Governor DeSantis's phrase. This is, we haven't seen this language since the church committee. So that's the kind of language we're seeing from institutional office holders. And a lot of it relates to what they're also talking about in Ukraine. Now, of course, it's amazing. Amnesty International finally tells a little bit of honesty and says, by the way, Ukraine kind of hides out in hospitals and schools and in private residences. So that's probably not a good thing to use civilians as shields. And they get so much blowback, they issue an apology. They keep the statement at least, unlike CBS. CBS comes out and outs, about more than 2 cents out of 3. So 70% of the money that we're sending over there, it doesn't actually go to what we say it does, which is what we talked about from the very beginning. We call, Putin shills and Russian propaganda and all that jazz. And if the Alex Jones court could have their way, I'm sure that they would have bankrupted us years ago, immediately and imminently as a threat to the deep state in America. But, we talked about this was going to be used for arms trafficking and arms laundering. That's exactly what even Western reports are now putting out, that the money is going to be used as a black budget for the black ops of black book operatives and a lot of money laundering. That's the famous photo of Joe Biden is at the Ukraine laundromat, and it's just the cash going around. That evidence has come out that there's risk of human trafficking, the refugee situation being misused and misappropriated for human trafficking purposes. What else do you think is going to happen when a country says the men can't leave, but the women should? Right? I mean, what are you inviting when you do that? It was like the Clinton special deals with Haiti after the earthquake, and what later got revealed connected to that. And going back to the Clinton Epstein comment about from Alex Jones during the trial. But, the human trafficking, the arms trafficking, the money laundering, the massive corruption, now the West is starting to slowly kind of admit it. My guess is partially this is a deep state divide that we talked about last time, that there's aspects of this people like, get out, we're screwed anyway. Let's limit the damage. Let's limit the harm. Let's take an exit ramp and move on to someplace else. And then another part of it is that part of the deep state that wants the war to continue, but that is already looking at who's going to be the sin goat offering, who's going to be the scapegoat. And it's going to be, it wasn't that our weapons failed. That can't be it, because that would make the military-industrial complex look bad. Not good advertising to say your weapons weren't the greatest things in the world. You can't say it was NATO's strategy, because then NATO looks like an empty tiger. So you can't say that the NATO operatives and the NATO training, because we've invested billions for a decade in Ukraine and on this nonsense. We can't blame the trainers. We can't blame the de facto commanders on the ground in places like Lviv and elsewhere across the Polish border. We can't blame the State Department. They're wonderful, good, brilliant people like wonderful Vicki Nuland, etc. It's got to be that Zelensky in Ukraine was just too corrupt. That had to be the problem. If they just would have done what we said they should do, then Russia would have lost. Then there would have been a wonderful Ukrainian victory, so on and so forth. So I think that's what you guys have been talking about has been happening and being reported 2-3 days after you guys discuss it comes out.
Yeah.
Just on a side note,
That doesn't exist anymore, just in case you didn't know. Wow, what's 70% not going? We're sorry about that. Disappeared from the internet overnight.
Yeah, just as a side note, real quick, when I was in Belgrade, I met someone that was on the list. She was on the blacklist, yeah, because she wrote like 2-3 articles critical of Zelensky, and then she said she traveled one time to the Donbass, and she was put on the list.
I mean, can I just make a point about that? I mean, you're talking about, the United States giving money to a government that is essentially putting US senators on blacklists. My memory goes back to the 60s and the early 70s. I'm just trying to imagine South Vietnam putting people like Martin Luther King, Senator Fulbright, Walter Cronkite, all of these sorts of Robert Kennedy on blacklists. I mean, it is inconceivable. It beggars belief that it could have happened. And I mean, it does show, to my mind, how the extent to which the United States has changed. And you mentioned Tom Paine. I wish people would sometimes go and read examples of Tom Paine's journalism. If they have, if they find that, sometimes, Alex Jones goes a bit too far, perhaps that's what they feel. Just read Tom Paine, see how far he went. And, he is considered one of the founders, as I understand it. He's considered one of the founders of the United States. He was there, I believe, played a role at the time, when the Constitution was set up. I think Americans need to remember a little, both of their own traditions and of the kind of way in which the United States once responded. I can tell you this, if President Thieu of South Vietnam had come along and started creating blacklists and started putting prominent Americans on them, the America of the 60s and of the 1970s, which I remember very well, would have told Thieu, well, they would have expressed themselves to him in language which I'm absolutely not going to use on this program. But I mean, it is inconceivable that it would ever have been permitted at one time. Anyway, let's get to the situation quickly in Ukraine. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think they are starting to sense in Washington, less so in London, by the way, that they got a debacle on their hands, and I think that they are starting to distance themselves and to tiptoe away from it. I think that the fact that the Great Kherson counteroffensive hasn't happened has been a sort of major disillusioning experience. My sense, by the way, is that here in Britain, we are getting a bit nervous about the way things are shaping out. But I think there's a certain fear that if things really go wrong in Ukraine, which they will, certainly Zelensky will get blamed, but another party is going to get blamed as well. And that is Britain, the British government, because I'm getting the feeling that, a lot of this bad advice is going to be advice that was given to Zelensky by Britain. That Britain encouraged him to go for this Kherson counteroffensive. Britain encouraged him to do all kinds of strange things, like attack Snakes Island and get his troops killed in that kind of way. And that what we're going to hear is a narrative that, that we in the United States, we got it all right. Zelensky wouldn't listen to us. He did all the wrong things. And of course, those people he did listen to were the British, and the British, of course, were giving him bad advice. So, by the way, I happen to think that's also true, but I do get the sense that there is growing nervousness in London that, we are also in Britain going to be set up as the scapegoat when this all goes hideously wrong, as it is increasingly looking like it will.
Yeah, so I guess instead we'll just bumble and stumble our way into a conflict with a different nuclear power. And I think, what's extraordinary is it was great to see once again for those folks out there that are critical of Trump, still the main Western politician that said we needed peace in Ukraine many months ago, was Donald Trump, as Noam Chomsky acknowledged. And once again, the only guy in a high-ranking position in the West, and particularly the United States, criticizing what's going on in Taiwan is, again, Donald Trump. He said Pelosi doesn't know what she's doing and da-da-da, and said this was a bad idea. There was no reason to do this. There's no reason to create that predicate. Now, I think domestically, China plays different politically in the United States than Russia does, at least on the right. And so you have, because of anti-communist beliefs amongst the American political right, you also have evangelicals and the Falun Gong and the support for the Tibetans and the Dalai Lama, religious, spiritual-based movements that have opposition to the CCP. You have native Taiwanese and Chinese refugees, and then aspects of the political asylum refugees, and then aspects of the labor movement. When I worked with the AFL-CIO many years ago when I was in college, we worked with Harry Wu involving Chinese labor practices, so on and so forth. So there's aspects of the labor movement that have their own reason for opposition to the CCP, and then you have some populists who don't want the Chinese social credit system expanded, don't want the Chinese method of governance extended, but is more the Trumpian position, mostly focused on trade policy and how China impacts America, and want to limit that adverse impact, but don't want to regulate China's internal affairs and don't want to get involved in a war with China. And that's basically has always been the Trumpian position. Wanted to leverage China for a peace deal with North Korea. Would have happened, but for John Bolton being appointed thanks to Sean Hannity, that derailed that and blew that up right on the eve of it being announced and occurring. He wanted and then otherwise his focus was economic control. You didn't hear him talk a lot about Hong Kong, the Dalai Lama, Tibet, the Uyghurs, Taiwan, a lot of these issues. What he did talk about was whether the pandemic came from a Chinese laboratory. What he did talk about was not liking the Chinese social credit system and corruption of intellectual property and political and legal issues in the United States, issues about the Confucius Institute and whether people were being bought off and corrupted and so forth. And then mainly economics, jobs shifting from the Rust Belt of the United States that became the Rust Belt of the United States because they got shifted to China. That was Trump's overwhelming obsession, and he wasn't willing to get involved in a dumb war. Now, the neocons and the neoliberals are a little different. The neocons have been talking about, one of the first books about the deep state in the modern era was written about how neocon interest in D.C. wanted to go to war with China. This was written back, I think, in 2014, so while Obama was president. So you had some move afoot for a range of reasons. Part of that's in the military-industrial complex, goes all the way back to World War II, where MacArthur, LeMay, you had a bunch of generals who believed in nuclear war. And wanted to engage him. It's like Operation Northwoods was signed off by the Joint Chief of Staff to have false flags stay. It's one of the things they wouldn't allow Alex Jones to introduce into his trial. It's like, hey, there's a reason why I have suspicions about when the government tells me something. But it was because LeMay believed that nuclear war was inevitable and inescapable, so he might as well use it, whereas guys like MacArthur and others thought it was just a useful weapon. He wanted to use it when we were in conflict with China over Korea. He wanted to nuclear bomb North Korea. People forget we bombed the hell out of North Korea in America. It's like there's a reason why North Korea, it isn't just the craziness of the North Korean governance that is part of the reason for the populist belief that America might do horrendous things to North Korea. It's because of what we actually did do in the 1940s and what MacArthur wanted to do. And then LeMay and others, in fact, they gave the proposal to President Eisenhower to nuke China. I mean, that was on the agenda twice during the different Taiwan Strait crises that happened in the early 1950s. And luckily, it was Eisenhower was like, no, hold on a second. We're not going to war with China. No, bad idea. But that's what the generals wanted. And so you have some people right now, just like there were some who thought we could win a limited nuclear war with Russia, who you see a lot of this stuff about the Chinese military, and maybe aspects of it are true, I don't know. But it sounds an awful lot like what I heard being said about the Russian military, about how it's really much weaker than people think it is, going to fall apart, it's not that strong, we're going to beat it, you're going to watch it, they're going to forfeit, they're going to forego, they don't even have, things to keep from frostbite. I mean, fake story after fake story after fake story. So, but you have people in the military apparatus here in the United States that truly believe that about China, that think we could win a war with China and want to prove it. And again, what good are weapons if you don't use them? You got to advertise them for the military-industrial complex. Afghanistan didn't turn out such a good ad. Ukraine sure didn't turn out such a good ad. So maybe China can turn out to be a decent ad. So you have that aspect. And then with the neoliberals, what's confusing to people on the right here is the degree of collusion with various CCP members all the way back to the Clinton administration leads them to believe, there's actually a popular belief here that Nancy Pelosi was just a feint, that she's really secretly working for the Chinese. This is to distract the fact that she's working for the Chinese, to create a fake story around how she's triggering a conflict, and that's not at all happening because Pelosi and the Biden and the neolibs are in the pockets of the Chinese. And I think it reflects one key false premise, which is globalists don't see themselves as working for the Chinese. They see the Chinese Communist Party as working for their agenda. And the moment they think they're no longer working for them, they're happy to dispatch them. And that's where I think, yes, there's a lot of evidence of corruption involving China and the Democratic Party and neoliberal establishment, including think tanks, including academies, including corporate properties, including major Wall Street investments like BlackRock that are heavily invested in, leveraged in China, like the Pelosi family, et cetera, and Hunter Biden specifically in the Bidens. But that doesn't change that they see themselves, and they see China as their factory worker, that they thought Xi was getting out of line for the last several years. Just follow what George Soros says on this. He's been calling for regime change in China now for several years, just like he wanted regime change in Russia, because they're happy as long as China keeps their head down, makes a lot of money for big Western corporate interest, continues to serve dollar dominance, and gets to experiment on their domestic population with a social credit system or mass lockdowns in ways they would like to experiment in the West. But what they're not in favor of is an actually independent China that sees their own interest as independent of and sovereign and different and superior to globalist interests. And that's why the risk of conflict is real. And that's why Pelosi's doing what she's doing. Though I do think you guys have nailed it. They think the world is the 1990s. So I think they really didn't think China would escalate to doing war games of a blockade around Taiwan. I think they really thought, they'll just talk a little, go back home. And we've seen otherwise, and that's why it's not. You look at the global history over time, over 5,000 plus years, as you guys have, then you know that the risk of civilizations and governments collapsing and falling is more often from their incompetence than it is from their malevolence. And we're seeing that in live time, the risk of it in live time in the West, I think, in China.
I completely agree. Now, can I just say, I think you're absolutely right in the sense that back in the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, there were all sorts of people in the United States who felt that, the United States was actually using China. And they were also saying to themselves, we can make lots of money out of this. We can go to China, we can get very close to the Chinese, we can facilitate the Chinese in all kinds of ways, but ultimately we are the masters here. And of course, what was actually happening is that the Chinese were using them. The Chinese, to a great extent, and they're straightforward about it, they took a lot of these people for a ride. I mean, I say that, one must qualify that because those people did make lots of money and gained lots of influence and did very well personally out of all of this, out of this relationship with China. But I think it's a much more complicated relationship than simply saying that because these people were taking money from Chinese companies, that somehow made them straightforwardly Chinese agents. I think this is too simplistic a view of a much more complex relationship, and one which, by the way, as I remember in the 1990s and early 2000s, we were very apprehensive about in Europe. People were talking in Europe at that time about Chimerica. China, America merging together, this huge economic complex, the United States owning vast areas of the Chinese economy and dominating the world that way, even as, industry relocated from the United States to China. Of course, it didn't work out like that because the Communist Party of China had its own ideas. It was interested about its own power. It was not interested about becoming part of a system in which a few privileged people in the United States who misunderstood things profoundly, that they would be in charge. So that's where this whole thing began to break down. I'm also going to say this. I think you're also absolutely right that where Donald Trump is concerned, his overwhelming concerns are about the United States and about the American people. Now, I'm not saying he's somebody who just doesn't care about what goes on in other countries. He clearly does. Everybody, by the way, and I've read this from people who are very critical of Donald Trump, people on the left, but people who've got access to Donald Trump, speak of him as a person who, at a certain level, is a kind person. I know that sounds a strange thing to say, but he is, apparently. He's got that sort of sense of empathy. But his primary worry is about the people of the United States, the kind of jobs they have, the kind of economy that the United States has. That's what is his focus. And I think that Donald Trump, he's not about getting involved in quarrels where the United States has no particular interest. And if the United States has to get involved in quarrels sometimes, he believes firmly that the United States should pick its quarrels wisely. It should not just get sucked in on, to things where American interests are not directly involved and where American power might find itself stretched or overextended or placed at risk, or heavens help us, might not even prevail. So I don't think that Donald Trump would ever have allowed himself to get drawn into a struggle over Taiwan. And I can completely understand why he is now critical of Nancy Pelosi and of the whole nonsense that's emerged there. He would have said, this isn't in the interest of the United States to pick a quarrel with China over Taiwan, especially not in this way. If the Chinese want to do their own things in China, well, that's their business. My concern, I remember him saying that in the very first speech that he made when he addressed as president the United Nations General Assembly. He said, I'm not the president of the world. I am the president of the United States of America. That is what I'm about. That is what I have been elected by the American people to be. And that, of course, puts him profoundly at variance with all of those people we've just been talking about who have globalist ideas and globalist views. Now, can I just say, I've been to China. I've seen the system there. I've visited Shanghai. I can understand why there's a lot about China today that Americans might find difficult. I found it extremely difficult. I found it a very controlled society. I found it in very many respects a very impressive society. It's certainly not one that I would want to see reproduced in my own country, in Britain. The Chinese wanted to export that kind of model here to Britain. I'm not in Britain at the moment, but to Britain. I would not want to go that way. So I can understand why Americans feel uncomfortable about China. And though I disagree with this view profoundly, I can also understand why some Americans, looking at the great increase in Chinese power over the last 30 or so years, say this is a rival that's emerged. We're in a fight with the Chinese. We must prevail against them. I personally, having seen how China works, don't think that the United States needs to be worried. I am sure that in straightforward, fair competition, the United States can more than hold its own against China. I've been there. I was impressed by what I saw, but I have no doubt at all that America has all the qualities, all the assets, all the resources to be able to maintain competition against China by itself. But this is not what this whole Taiwan thing is all about. It's just about starting some kind of quarrel over an issue, Taiwan, which up to very recently had been stable. The Chinese pretended that one day Taiwan would become part of China. The United States pretended that it abided by the one China policy. And the Taiwanese pretended, well, that they were able to do their own thing. And everybody was happy with these pretenses, and everything went perfectly well. Everybody understood everyone else, and it was a stable situation. And now what we see is neocons coming along, and they want to make it somehow once more an issue of some kind of principle. We're going to defend Taiwan against the Chinese. Of course, one feels that they're not really interested in Taiwan itself. They're not concerned about the Taiwanese people, what will happen to them. What they want is they want to use Taiwan to start this new competition, this war against China. China, they think, is it's military. It's never fought a war for 40 years. It's not really up to very much. This is the moment when we can push back against the Chinese. We can humiliate them. We can call China's bluff. Its military is a paper tiger. We have to do it now. In 10 years, in 20 years, they will have built up their new nuclear arsenal. So this is the moment to strike. And we've got a crisis on our hands where there wasn't one, just didn't need to be. And that's what Donald Trump and people of a realistic view would say. It's a completely wrong policy. It's completely misconceived to conduct your foreign policy in that kind of way.
Yeah, there was a great breakdown by Colonel McGregor. I think it was on Jackson Hinkle's show, where he was talking about that it makes no sense to wage war with China. And the other thing he did well, which is a point I think that you've highlighted well, Alexander, that shifted some of my perspective on the risk of conflict over Taiwan, is if we look at this from the Chinese perspective, two things may be at play. Xi looking at getting reappointed for a term, basically practically for life almost, but for renewing that amidst economic issues in China that may be part of the reason why people in the State Department thought they could use this to trigger not a war, but regime change in China, because you have the real estate issues and the financial issues in the sense that they've been building a real estate bubble in China now for multiple years. There was a range of incentives that they create. It's a problem with an authoritarian economic model, that these incentives can get out of hand when not checked by the market, then end up being tied into the financial and banking system. And now parts of that are cascading back against them. And the question is, what systemic or institutional risk does it pose beyond the Evergrandes of China and the rest? And a useful distraction could be going in and taking back Taiwan for the Chinese people and population that consider it part of China, especially triggered by this Pelosi action that she took. So you have like that on the one hand. The other aspect I think that McGregor also mentioned when he talked about almost all of China's military defense prioritization has been avoiding what happened to them in the 1800s and the 1900s. And that I think was very informative, was your framing of this, that this isn't about China and Taiwan as much as it is China and the 18th and 19th and 20th century having their country taken apart either culturally or geographically or territorially because of foreign invaders and their inability to protect themselves from those foreign invaders, including how they defended the river system and the land system. And not only the Brits, but the Brits most famously, Hong Kong, people forget, we forced opium on them. And by we, I mean the West. America didn't have much of involvement in that, only tangential. But there's the Philippines and the rest of the landed, parts of Asia, but not China. That was mostly the Brits. But Hong Kong was given to an opium dealer, for crying out loud. It was forcing opium on the Chinese people against the will of the Chinese government and society. And then you had the Portuguese that are there. I mean, Macau was originally the gambling island was originally Portuguese island. All kinds of people were at Formosa that became Taiwan at different times. Then, of course, so you had all of that in the 1800s, and then that was followed by the Japanese in the 1900s committing acts that were equally horrendous as the Nazis. I mean, and they literally had sex slavery stations along the military path. They were doing the same, but sometimes worse, biological experimentation than what the Nazis were doing. So just, the rape of Shanghai, quite famously, which was literally that. And so when you have that memory, which really isn't taught well in the West, this is seen as China being imperialistic towards Taiwan, not towards an independent Taiwan. Taiwan is seen as universally desiring independence, not a very split population historically and even currently. But that this is not really about Taiwan. This is about defending against foreign influence, using Taiwan to attack and undermine China's independence and sovereignty from the Chinese perspective. And that's what McGregor pointed out. He goes, look, they've designed their military systems so that what happened in the 1800s and 1900s can't happen again, which means it can't happen again. It's like nobody's landing in China and taking over China. Nobody's going up the waterways. Nobody, U.S. subs have dominance. So the Chinese anti-sub system is definitely militarily, by most analyst acknowledgement, behind the U.S., as most parts of the world are. But there's only so much subs can do. So it can't win you an entire war. So McGregor's point was it makes no sense. You can't ultimately win it given Chinese perspective. But the question is, do these internal economic dynamics, how serious are they? There's a lot of debate about that. We can't get honest information out of the West anymore because they're either deeply anti-China or because in the mind of a lot of people on the left, if you're anti-imperialist, you're pro whoever the imperialist is going after. So like a lot of the people that are will defend China, I honestly just don't trust their perspectives because I see how strong this belief, this bias can be. And so consequently in the West, it's hard to know what's happening. And then, of course, China isn't exactly the freest country on the planet, so you're not going to get robust debate or information out of China either. But I think you're right. The risk of something happening in Taiwan is substantially escalated because of how China historically and contemporaneously sees foreign threats using Taiwan. And then you have these other internal and other economic dynamics and then deep state dynamics that may be pushing us towards an unfortunate but inescapable conflict. But what do you guys think on the economic side? How serious of a risk is that for China? And this goes on top of zero COVID and repeat lockdowns and supply chain issues and all the rest. I don't see the U.S. being able to do, or the West being able to do, the same set of sanctions that they tried and failed to use against Russia, because we can't replace, we saw in the COVID lockdowns, we can't replace the supply chains that quickly at this point. We need to have a 5-10 year project to replace, that's what Trump wanted, to replace those supply chains. Doing it overnight will just trigger a further economic collapse in an economy that's already collapsing. I mean, we redefine the word recession, so magically it's no longer a recession. Vaccine isn't a vaccine, recession isn't a recession, inflation is inflation, war isn't war. It's extraordinary everything that's going on. A raid isn't even a raid. The MSNBC and CNN made clear, no, this was a search warrant approved case involving Donald Trump. There was no raid. What I call it, they call it a raid. But what do you think what do you think about the economic aspects in China? And where are we on the scale of risk of conflict over Taiwan?
That's a very good question. Very, very good questions. Now, can I just say, I have never obtained the kind of granular understanding of China that I have of Russia. Obviously, China is a vastly bigger economy than Russia's is. It's a more complex economy. But so, you can learn quite a lot about Russia, and it's digestible. Now, gradually, I've come to the view that nobody actually has a granular understanding of China. And part of the reason is because China is very opaque. It is so complex. Statistics don't mean the same as they might in other places. You can't rely on them to the same extent. And I wonder actually, and whether the leaders in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai, in the the People's Bank of China, how far they really understand exactly what is going on. When you go to China, I mean, the vastness of the place is what really astonishes you, because of course you have provinces which are as big as countries, European countries. You have cities, megalopolises like Shanghai. And on the one hand, you have this incredible control from the center, but you do wonder to what extent that control is even real, and whether the economy is really controlled and how well it's controlled. Because you're absolutely right, Robert. A lot of the disciplines and clarity that market relations impose don't straightforwardly apply to China anymore. I'm going to give my own view about China, and it's a bit out of date. I was there in 2017, and it's a bit impressionistic. But my own sense was massive overcapacity, that that there is enormous, almost bloated manufacturing sector, which has been constructed to supply goods to China itself and to the entire world, but is probably too big. A massive construction boom that has long ago run out of control, and again is not easily cannot easily absorb. China itself cannot easily absorb all the things that it has been doing. And I'm going to say this, a retail sector, which also seems to me to be completely out of control. Now, I was in Shanghai, which is obviously, China's big commercial economic hub. And I remember sort of traveling around, seeing all these vast arcades of shops and things. And the things that struck me about them instantly was that they were all deserted. This wasn't during a time of, economic crisis in China, but there was just too much on sale for people to buy. It all looked somewhat unbalanced. Now, obviously, again, I stress this is impressionistic, and it may be that there are other aspects of this economy that I haven't really completely understood. But I did speak to a friend of mine there who was a banker, by the way, a Russian, and working for a Russian bank. And he said to me that his bank, which was one of the very few banks that had been given permission by the Chinese authorities to operate in China as a Chinese bank, that his bank was finding it extremely difficult to find Chinese companies it could lend to, because all the Chinese companies it was dealing with, by conventional criteria, were trading insolvently. So that was already somewhat alarming. And it did strike me that this could only function, this economic system could only function within a extremely controlled way, a currency that is very tightly controlled, debt issuance that is extremely tightly controlled. And one does wonder whether those economic controls, a little bit like QE in the West, it makes things possible for a certain period of time. But ultimately, the imbalances become so extreme that even this mechanism of controls that has been created in China simply can't sustain the contradictions indefinitely, and that at some point, some kind of reckoning will be made. And if you come back to some of these lockdowns and pandemic responses, which to my mind seem irrational, I do wonder whether perhaps they have other motivations than just dealing with pandemic issues, whether they aren't devices, in part perhaps to prepare the Chinese economy for situations where it might be faced with sanctions and all the usual pressures that we've been hearing about because of the external pressures on China, but whether also it might be a mechanism to try to deal with an economy that in some sectors may be overheating. I won't deny I haven't thought of those possibilities. But I want to stress, these are, again, impressions. I can't definitely say that they are true. It may be that there is more going on in China than I can understand, and that the situation is perhaps more balanced than it appeared to me to be. But on the face of it, it did look to me like a system where things are seriously out of sync, which is not to deny, by the way, that at certain levels, when you look at what's been achieved, it is also incredibly impressive. But impressive, Versailles looked impressive in its day, and the foundations on which it was constructed, as we subsequently found out in historical time, turned out to be a little insecure. So maybe there are things wrong. Maybe things have gone too far, too fast, that there's structural imbalances that could shape out. Now, about the situation with Taiwan, I have to say this. It struck me immediately that a lot of the legitimacy, the political legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of China, is based upon the fact that it ended that century of humiliation that you're referring to, and which Lieutenant Colonel McGregor was also referring to. And part of the narrative that every Chinese person, and this is a very historically minded society, every Chinese person knows about that century of humiliation, is that parts of China were carved out of the Chinese motherland. So China lost Hong Kong. There was the international settlements in Shanghai. By the way, I should say that during the 19th century, the general attitude in China towards the United States was strongly positive, because the United States was seen as a country that was not seeking to carve out bits of China as the European colonial powers were doing. So there was a historical legacy of within China of looking favorably to the United States, which has unfortunately dissipated to some degree. But anyway, there was this sense that you must keep the Chinese nation together. You must keep the foreigner out. You can't allow bits of China to be broken away. The Western powers did that before. And of course, the Communist Party of China ended that, except of course they didn't fully end it, because there are still bits of China that were not reunited with the motherland. Hong Kong you mentioned, Macau you've mentioned, but the big one is Taiwan. So unless you are able to assert Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, China's unity is not established. China's process of rejuvenation, as the Chinese themselves talk about it, can never be fully complete. And the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China itself is at issue. And if it seems that China has irretrievably lost Taiwan, then for the Communist Party of China, it becomes an existential problem, because they have failed to deliver on their historic mission. And at that point, it could face a crisis. Now, that means that the communist government in China is never going to allow Taiwan to break away. It is for them existential, and they will move to prevent it. I don't know to what extent that is understood in the United States. The Chinese will fight for Taiwan. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt at all.
Now, to what extent, by the way, a little side point, McGregor made an interesting analogy.
Yeah.
He said the U.S. should recognize that Russia has legitimate security concerns about Ukraine, and China has legitimate security concerns about Taiwan, just as we asked the world to recognize we had legitimate concerns about Soviet missiles in Cuba, which was a fascinating kind of historical analogy I hadn't heard made before. But as to Taiwan, a lot of the commentary I get and questions I get, and I don't know enough about it in detail to give an analysis myself. But what do you think about is that the semiconductor chip industry, which is so strong in Taiwan, the theory is that if there was an effective blockade on Taiwan, this would create a serious economic risk in the supply chains around the Western world. Well, what's your understanding of that?
Well, I think that is probably true. My understanding is that this is really applies to the very high-end chips, which Taiwan and South Korea are the two countries that make. But South Korea absorbs, it uses most of its chips, these high-end chips itself. They're made by Samsung, and Samsung makes them for its own products, whereas Taiwan makes them to sell them around the world. So you get your phones, and they will use Taiwanese chips because they're the right ones for achieving the kind of things that the top end of mobile phones can do. So I think that will complicate, undoubtedly, supply chain issues. And we come back to this question of timing. We have an inflation crisis around the world. The United States, I have to say this, is at the center of this inflation crisis. And anybody who thinks that this inflation crisis was not in some way caused by the Biden administration's utterly reckless and irresponsible spending programs in the first year of the administration is simply not familiar. I'm going to say it politely, with the economic realities. So the United States, the administration, let me stress, the administration created an inflation crisis. It's made it worse through this economic war it's fought with Russia, which has disrupted raw material supply chains, commodity supply chains, food, oil. I don't think that's even disputed very much any longer. You're going to start a crisis with China, and China blockades Taiwan and chips, which at the moment no one else is making apart from the South Koreans, but they can't, substitute for these chips. Those high-end chips are not exported from Taiwan because Taiwan is blockaded. Well, that's going to disrupt supply chains even more. And it's going to crank up inflation even more. And just to throw in something, I mean, we've now just had a new bill passed by Congress. It's going to go to Biden's signature. I've been trying to make sense of this new inflation reduction bill. It seems to me it's completely misnamed. It's an inflation expansion bill. It's just another $800 billion of extra spending, which is the last thing you need at this time. And you're going to increase taxes because, to be very clear, that's what you're going to do. You're going to increase especially taxes on corporates, which is going to put pressure on corporates and will probably lead them to cut investment because that's what they will do, which will affect production. So you're going to increase demand. You're going to reduce supply. You're going to create a problem with chips. It's going to push inflation up even more. You do not want a crisis over Taiwan at this time. I mean, if you're going to sort out your problems with chips, you've got to do something. It's very Trumpian. You've got to try and recreate production of chips in the United States. Disastrous, by the way, that the United States ever threw that enormous asset it had away in that kind of fashion. But firstly, you've got to restart that production. Then, once you've done that, perhaps, possibly, I mean, it still may not be the wisest thing to do, but then maybe you can start to say, well, we can start to take positions on Taiwan, which the Chinese might not like, because at the end of the day, it's not going to have this massive impact on our supply chains. You don't just rush into this and then say to yourself, well, this is a problem that we've not thought about. We've not thought it through. You're reading articles of the Financial Times saying that they didn't think through the sanctions against Russia. Well, I can see quite easily in a few months' time people saying, well, we didn't think it through in the same way about Taiwan and its chips. I mean, it's bizarre that we got into this position, but that's, I think, where we are. So I think it is a serious problem, and it's one for which we have no answer or response to at this present time.
Yeah, to the super chat question, everybody that looks at military analysis recognizes how geopolitically significant Taiwan is to China's internal security and safety on multiple grounds, not just his historic use as a living aircraft carrier, but a wide range of other reasons due to its unique location in the South China Seas vis-a-vis China. And then you have some of the little islands around Taiwan that Taiwan still claims title to that led to prior disputes in the Taiwan Straits in the 1950s. But yeah, I agree that on the economic side, it's insanity because so we have the Federal Reserve pretending that they can manipulate the commercial banks into inducing a recession by increasing rates, and it appears all they're effectively doing is taking down the housing market and taking down the stock market, not reducing inflation. And with things like this, only going to lead to, just like the Ukraine conflict, not really the Ukraine conflict. It's like the pandemic didn't cause issues. The Ukraine conflict didn't cause issues. The Taiwan conflict didn't cause issues. Lockdowns, dumb sanctions policies, and dumb war policies caused issues. But the budget is definitely no solution any more than the Fed. Because for those people, I mean, it's a drawn down version of Build Back Better, though the joke is that it turned out Biden did have a Build Back Better plan. It was just for Ukraine, and that's not working out any better than the U.S. But I mean, we're sending billions and billions and billions on a daily basis to Ukraine. They brag about this as if it's popular when its popularity is cascading due to the failure of the war, its weakness of economics around the globe, the potential fuel shortages and famine issues, food shortages that are incipient. And so, but then you add on top of all of that, the budget policy that's a combination of three things. One, attempt to create a global corporate tax by making a 15% tax across Western countries, which in turn is premised, I think will be used as the premise for a global digital currency, because in order to effectively collect the tax, in order to effectively enforce the tax, in order to gather the information necessary to enforcement, they're going to say they need one shared global digital currency to do so. But the reality is the disaster and debacle of the economic war on Russia, compounded by going after Brazil, India, China. We're busy doing our Africa coercion tour that we do each year. You know, at least Bono isn't along for the ride with Bill Gates promoting certain things. But you know, we were out threatening different people. You know, here's the carrot, here's the stick, here's the carrot, here's the stick. See who can jump on board. As if we convert Rwanda, that beacon of integrity of government and history, that's going to mean something for the conflict. But they're still mad because Lavrov's happy tour in Africa, everybody's shaking his hands, and Blinken's got to match it, and he's not going to match it. Nobody likes Blinken. Now, no, people in the United States don't even like Blinken. So why is anybody in Africa going to like Blinken? But the economic policy is just compounding it, which is payoffs basically to certain donors, right? Things that are going to be sold as climate change. They're just payoffs to a bunch, just like the Ukraine budget was a deep state budget, military industrial complex budget, State Department budget, etc. A black budget for them to operate their black ops. But the same thing here is that a lot of the money isn't going to impact climate change, whatever you think about climate change for the folks out there. It goes back, you can watch Michael Moore's movie, Planet of the Humans. I don't agree with aspects of its premise, but he does do a good job of exposing how much scam and grift there is in that entire environmental clean energy industry. I mean, if you're on the left, the Koch brothers are going to get a lot of these credits. I mean, that gives you an idea for what's going on. So the And then on the tax side, you have the corporate tax trying to create a global digital currency, which isn't going to go anywhere ultimately anyway. It'll probably fall disproportionately on domestic manufacturers because they're trying to close certain tax loopholes that are actually critical and essential to domestic manufacturing in America, change accounting rules and other things that will make everything a mess. But there's a reason why we don't have a global standardized tax system. Different political interests, different economies, different nations' customs. There's no way to create this. It's just another disaster. And then on top of this, there's a bunch of little taxes to whack people, but the real big announcement was 87,000 new IRS agents who are just busy buying over 1 million rounds of ammunition last month. And, basically, while they're waging lawfare against Alex Jones, politicizing the criminal justice process against the former and future president of the United States, Donald Trump, they're going to unleash about 100,000 IRS agents on the rest of us. I brought the biggest Bivens class action against the IRS in American history because Obama's administration was trying to do this. And they were enforcing, in the name of enforcing the personal insurance requirement under Obamacare, they were seizing people's medical records. They seized 60 million medical records of 10 million Americans, including every judge and every family member of that judge in the state of California, Major League Baseball, producers, directors, screen actors, stars and celebrities. I knew all kinds of things because these are people. Imagine if you knew whose wife was going or husband was going to sex addiction therapy. Imagine if you knew whose kid was secretly in drug rehab. Imagine if you knew which baseball player had 3 undisclosed injuries. Imagine if you knew which actor was unbondable for the 2 undisclosed heart attacks. What if you knew that director not only had this problem and that problem, he had 3 other problems he was seeking psychotherapy for? Things that would ruin, I called it J. Edgar Hoover's wet dream of a blackmail file, is what they were gathering through the IRS. So the IRS has the IRS uses its confessions of a tax collector, reads like Lord Conrad going into the heart of the jungle. I mean, the IRS talking about, I know everything about your life. I know your significant others are, your church is, your school is, because our tax forms are used to be confessionals to rat ourselves out and our friends and our family and our neighbors. They know why didn't they give a deduction for what political party you make a contribution for? Why didn't they give you a deduction for which nonprofits you contribute to? Because they get all that information about you. You freely give it on your tax form each year. As well as your friends and your family and your religious affiliations and your residence and where your property is and where your assets are, where you spend money, et cetera, which tells a lot about you. It's the old Facebook joke. If you like 5 things, they know you as well as a friend. If you like 10 things, they know you as well as a good friend. If you like 25 things, they know you as well as your wife. And if you've liked 50 things on Facebook, they know you better than your wife. Same thing with the government. It's a massive rat self. And now they're going to unleash 87,000 agents. And this is after the Obama administration went after Tea Party conservatives, independent groups, political groups, raising questions, aspects of Occupy groups, etc. They're going to weaponize this, and that's the most terrifying aspect of this budget, is they're about to unleash the tax man on ordinary Americans, and we can trust it to be as apolitical as the Alex Jones trial and the Donald Trump search warrant.
Yeah, it is extremely, 87,000 new IRS people. I didn't know that, by the way, but that is absolutely horrifying. On the global tax thing, we talked about it before, I think, on an earlier program, but just to quickly say, it's a lunatic idea because, of course, governments around the world, it's unworkable. Any idea that is unworkable is by definition bad. But think about it. If you have a global tax system, that means you have an unaccountable tax system, because which parliament, which democracy, which electorate is going to be able to pass, to vote in a way that, changes tax policy? If this is done globally, it means that, well, who's controlling it ultimately? It's not difficult. It's the sort of globalists. It's not going to be you. If you have a government today that you vote for and which raises taxes, you can vote that government out of power if you don't agree with how it's raising taxes. But if you have a global tax system, you can't do that anymore because, well, no government globally is accountable in that kind of way. So it is actually both ludicrous and unworkable, and also profoundly dangerous and extremely sinister. And if you're going to start, having 87,000 more tax inspectors going around, going through records. Well, first of all, if you're thinking of expanding that around the world, well, that is extremely dangerous too, and that's presumably what you would have to do if you had a global system. But even if you have it domestically, it comes back to the point that we were discussing earlier in this program. What are courts for? They're there to uphold rights, not extinguish them. If taxes are being used in order to create bureaucracies that will survey people and watch people and start, collating information about them and controlling them, then we are in a very bad place. And again, it is remarkable that this is happening in the United States, of all places, given that how did the United States begin? It began as a result of a tax revolt against arbitrary taxation imposed by the Americans, by the British Crown.
Well, speaking of political weaponization of the court system, my favorite, eclectic legal topic of the last couple of weeks has been trading Brittany Griner for the Merchant of Death. And, what's fascinating about that is multiple levels. I am a critic of, I don't accept Russia's explanation that this was completely apolitical. From a political perspective, it was a smart move. They understand how the Biden administration works. You don't pick up a spy, even though he's part of the deal. You pick up a woke star, a lesbian WNBA player. That's who the U.S. will trade anybody for, which is just sad. But I have no doubt, I'm not a fan of Russia's drug laws. I'm not a fan of their criminal justice process. I think it could be dramatically improved. I think 9 years in a Russian penal colony for this is nonsense, though I do think all of it was motivated to exchange her, not really to lock her up. And to those who say America is completely hypocritical, agree entirely, since we lock up people for all kinds of stupid drug crimes all across the country. But to trade him for the Merchant of Death is fascinating. I mean, this is a guy, Nicolas Cage played in Lord of War. Basically, they retell the story, but it was motivated and inspired entirely by him. What's up? Oh, never mind. You look at that. Now, I think the other backstory I followed the Merchant of Death story for independent reasons, because I think part of the reasons the Russians were upset about it was the shenanigans the U.S. court system pulled. So the reality is we love the Merchant of Death up until he started working with Putin. That, during the 90s, he was CIA guys were his partners. This is now known public fact. The Merchant of Death is biographical in surprising ways about how the power structure and the military arms running really works, of which Ukraine is just our latest, most glaring example. But then Putin comes to power. He starts to shift his alignment. It's probably never good publicity to have a movie loosely made about you anyway when you're in the arms running business. But putting that aside, the guy clearly liked some of the public attention. That started putting him on some negative radars, but it was really his alignment with Putin that upset, I think, aspects of the deep state in the West. And that's when he really got put on a list. And the way he got prosecuted was we came up with a phony plot to meet him in a foreign country, propose it to him in another foreign country, to do arms from one foreign country to another foreign country about a foreign war. It's like, how does that involve U.S. criminal law? We have no U.S. citizens involved. We have no U.S. territory involved. We have no U.S. guns involved. Their loose pretext was, well, these guns might be used against Americans someday. And it's like, oh, no, that terms, Obama and Eric Holder should be in prison because of their little Fast and Furious little scheme that they ran, arming up Mexican drug lords and cartels that end up being used against American border guards, for which they all walk. Eric Holder famously committed contempt of Congress. He doesn't get prosecuted, but Steve Bannon does. Nobody had been prosecuted for contempt in 40 years in Washington until Steve Bannon. The political weaponization is off the charts. But the way, in fact, even the federal judge who presided over the case basically gave him the lowest possible sentence because she said Bout never would have committed this crime but for what the government did, making it up. And frankly, that usually is entrapment. Now, the problem in American law under entrapment is Bout would have to prove he had no propensity to do arms deals. That was a little tough for Bout to prove for a range of reasons. But Bout predicted. He said, "Don't worry, down the road, I'll be shipped back." And who would know? It's for a WNBA player. But that appears to be where we're heading.
Yeah. Extraordinary times. Most extraordinary times.
They knew what they were doing, Robert.
Oh, yes.
The Russians when they got it.
Oh, absolutely, they knew it.
Yeah.
And my guess is she'd been doing that regularly, and they had just not arrested her before.
She was 8 years.
This is the one accidental time she forgot to not take a bunch of drugs to the airport. I mean, she's been to Russia many, many times. So my guess is they knew it. They just said, "Hey, send the little dog over." Look, we got lucky. Who knew? And then it's, "Hey, send back Victor and send back the guy we had whack that former Chechen, in their minds, terrorist. That what was a Chechen terrorist doing, getting safe protection in Germany? I haven't heard an explanation from Germany on that.
No.
But I think they're in the better argument because Biden is over a barrel. Because who knew? Shooting down the plane, that those kind of people, you had to do great lengths to would get priority. But a woke WNBA star being the grounds to get back the Merchant of Death and the Lord of War shows the Russia understands Western politics better than the West does.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. And then you have Whelan, the other guy, who was in Russia, like a very low-level spy, it seems. I mean, the whole thing is just a complete freaking mess.
Yeah.
Insanity at new levels.
Yeah. It's a clown world.
It's a clown world.
All right. What do you guys say? We've been going for 2 hours and 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Perfect.
We covered a ton of ground.
We did. But this is a momentous, it's the day after a momentous day. A day that will live in infamy.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. We crossed the Rubicon.
Yeah.
And hopefully the question is we don't lead to the outcome that led to the last time somebody crossed the Rubicon.
Yeah.
That I agree with. Robert, you were fantastic.
Absolutely.
Alexander, fantastic. Where can people find you, Robert?
At vivabarneslaw.locals.com. That's where you can get all the content and produce and create your own content. I read every post that goes up there. I go to the Duran.locals.com, a few others, because the board is fantastic. So it's not only a place where you can get everybody's content and links to any content they create anywhere else, but it's the board itself that provides great curated materials, links to stories, interesting commentary. It's I like to say, as Garrison Keillor said about Lake Wobegon, everybody at vivabarneslaw.locals.com and the Duran.locals.com is above average. And that's what makes it a fun and great community to be a part of.
Absolutely. And I will put a link to those communities down below in the description box. And I will also put it as a pinned comment. Thank you to our moderators. Alan Watson, I believe you held the fort down solo. Thank you very much, Alan. Great job. And Reckless Abandon as well. Thank you as well, Reckless Abandon, for helping to moderate. Thank you to everyone that watched us on Odyssey, Rumble, YouTube, Telegram, and Locals. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.